Okay, we're picking back up in the next section of our notes today. We really don't have a huge long lecture to talk about, but I do want to address the third section of your notes, which are types of muscle contractions. So this comes on the heels of you having watched a lecture yesterday that revolved around motor units and sort of this thing called a graded muscle response, how muscle cells twitching stack their twitches and produce an overall muscle contraction. So when the muscle contracts, here are a couple of ways in which we can contract. And of course, as I say this, the first example that we're going to talk about, muscle tone, is actually not a true contraction. And so when we talk about muscle having tone, that's really, and you can kind of see it over here in the picture, it's not an actual contraction, but it's a little bit of tension that naturally exists within a skeletal muscle. And it's there because of our spinal reflexes. So let's write a little bit about that. Muscle tone is tension in a muscle at rest, which is different from a contraction of a muscle that you're attempting to, move a load with some force, right? And that provides a little bit of resistance and the muscle contracts. This tension in muscle tone is the result of your body's spinal reflexes maintaining a little bit of tension on your skeletal muscles at all times for the purpose of things like posture, movement, what I've called being response ready. And so think about if you had no muscle tone and you were sort of a lumpy bowl of jello and you needed to respond really quickly, it would take you a little bit longer. But if you're already a little bit tense, a little bit in position, your response or your reaction can be faster. And so muscle tone, as the result of spinal reflexes, goes away in people that have had spinal cord injuries. And so if you think about quadriplegics or paraplegics that really do not have movement of their arm or leg, but they also are lacking that tone as well. Their legs and their arms might begin to atrophy because they don't have the ability to maintain muscle tone or the ability to contract those skeletal muscles. And so they get smaller and smaller. So muscle tone is the first type of, quote, contraction, although it is not a true contraction. Now let's talk about the typical contractions that we think of. So the first category here is an isotonic contraction. Isotonic contractions are contractions in which the muscle organ, so think about those big, when I say muscle organ, I mean those big muscles that we've talked about, biceps, triceps, the different muscles of the quadriceps and the hamstrings, those are muscle organs. If the muscle organ changes in length during the contraction, it's an isotonic contraction. And so you can see there's two different kinds of isotonic contractions. One of those, the muscle gets shorter when the muscle contracts, and the other, the muscle actually lengthens. And so here are those two types: a concentric isotonic contraction, that's the top picture right here. Concentric contractions allow the muscle to shorten, and this helps with movements and motions like flexing. Eccentric is the other type of isotonic contraction that's seen down here in the bottom. Eccentric contractions are when the muscle lengthens in the contraction process, which is good for motions like extension or extending. So here we see almost antagonistic relationships. Remember, we learned about antagonistic muscle pairs. We see sort of antagonistic contractions happening here. One type of contraction, the muscle shortens. The other type of contraction, a muscle lengthens. And really, we're in doing that, if we're focused on one specific muscle like the bicep here, we're in performing both of these contractions, we are doing sort of opposite movements or motions. The reason that your muscle is changing its length is because you are applying enough force with your muscle to actually move whatever the load is. In this case, it's the little blue dumbbell. So as long as you have a force that is capable of moving a load, you can shorten and lengthen your muscles during contraction processes. And so those are all isotonic contractions when the muscle changes length. The final type of muscle contraction is not an isotonic, but an isometric contraction. And so isometric contractions are when the muscle does not change in length during the contraction process, which sounds odd, right? But think about why this might occur. Because you don't have enough force to move the load that you're trying to move. And so a great example of that would be planking, right? So in planking, you're pushing on the floor. And so you are exerting a force on the floor, but the floor is not going anywhere. Your force is not going to move that floor. And so in this scenario, the muscles in her arms are in an isometric contraction. She's also holding her position. So all of these muscles are sort of locked in place. They're in an isometric contraction. So the muscle length is not changing because she cannot actually move that floor in the plank. Some of you that have intentionally done workouts, you've maybe heard an isometric press. That's when you are perhaps lifting something that you can lift, but then you hold it in place. And so you stop exerting that force that is capable of moving the load, and your muscles sort of hold in position until you resume your workout. And so we can actually see these three types of movements together if we look at a squat. So please enjoy my little GIFs here. It took me a minute to insert them into the presentation. So let's talk about when you do a squat. Okay, so find a little space in your notes, maybe in the margins, or if you have a little bit left under isometric, to add this, because it's a great example of how it's not one or the other. We can actually see all of these contractions happening in a motion or in an exercise. So think about in the squat, when you bend your knees and lower yourself in the squat position, your quad muscles are in an eccentric contraction. When you hold the squat for a moment, that's an isometric contraction on your quad muscles. And then when you extend your knee and rise back up, you are shortening those quad muscles in a concentric contraction. So when you lower yourself, you're elongating those quad muscles, and you could kind of feel that. When you hold, you are pausing, sort of continuing the tension and the contraction within the muscles to kind of hover in that squat position for a second. And then when you rise back up, you can feel your quad muscles shorten in a concentric contraction. So in that movement, we see all three of these things happening. Okay, so this is the end of today's lecture. It's really, really short, but let me tell you something. I know that I have a sub today. You need to, if the sub hasn't already given you the exit slip, you need to prompt the sub. It's up on the front table. So you need to fill out an exit slip and you need to turn it in. You can start a pile on the front table, turn it in. If you're the first, be the first and start the pile. You also need to make sure that the sub hands you the practice document for Friday's at-home work. We're not at school this Friday. We're on asynchronous learning, so teachers can get their last rounds of vaccines. So if you go up to the front, there should be a packet of practice questions, diagrams, documents that you can take home for Friday. If you have a ton of time left in class right now, go ahead and do it, and you're done for Friday. I will see you all next week.